Today I thought I'd tell you how to make my particular brand of chocolate chip cookies called Mutha's cookies, in particular the Roadhouse recipe, which is my take on the Tollhouse recipe, traditional Tollhouse recipe. Okay, so as I said, we're going to start off with our mixing all our dry ingredients together. So start off with white flour. Um, I use white flour. I don't try to pretend that they're healthy using whole wheat flour. You might as well do the stuff that tastes the best, right? So I use 2 1/4 cups of flour, white flour, and it's just this is the same as the Toll House recipe. So no changes here on the flour, but basically you're getting 2 1/4 cups. Then you add about the same amount of baking soda. That is the same as the Toll House recipe, which they say anywhere from, well, I use pretty much about 3/4 of a teaspoon. They usually say a half. So then this is the first change in the recipe that I do, and that is usually they say adding, I think, a half teaspoon of salt. I add a whole teaspoon. And the idea behind it here is that with salt enhances the flavor. So if you want more of the chocolate chip flavor, more I should say of the flavor of the dough, the vanilla and everything, you add more salt. Not too much, but I just double it, and that enhances the flavor of the dough. So that is it with the dry ingredients. Then you mix that really well together. The whole idea behind this being mixing the wet and dry ingredients separate is that when you mix the dry ingredients first, you can really mix them together thoroughly when you do them separately. Once you get wet ingredients in there, it just doesn't mix as thoroughly. So they're dry. Okay, now for the wet ingredients. For the wet ingredients, I usually start off with 1 1/2 sticks of butter. Usually you're adding 2 whole sticks of butter, at least according to Toll House recipe. So I'm using 1 1/2 sticks of butter. This basically allows it makes the mixture so it doesn't seem to melt as quickly, and it keeps its form a little bit more. It keeps its cookie form, keeps it from splaying out on the cookie sheet too much. So I use 1 1/2 sticks of butter. First off, I go ahead and I put that in the microwave for maybe 20 seconds, and just to soften it, makes it easier to mix that way. And so next up, I add the sugar. We'll be adding the sugar, and what I do with the sugar is that I have a cup here, which is 3/4 white sugar and 1/2 brown sugar. The usual Toll House recipe calls for 1 1/2 cups of total sugar. That's 3/4 of brown, 3/4 of white. I cut back on the sugar. The idea here is that sugar overwhelms flavor when there's too much. So I'm only cutting back with 1/4 cup. but I've done it as much as a full half cup and it's been just fine. If you really like them to be sweet, um, you might want to do the full 1.5. But if the general cookie mixture is just a little sweet for you, cut back on a 1/4 cup. And another thing is you can play around with the white to brown white and brown sugar mixture. You can, if you like them to be more soft and chewy, then you might want to have a little more brown sugar than white sugar. If you like them to be a little bit more firm, cakey, you might have a little bit more white than brown. And that's what I'm doing with this, just a slight bit more white than brown. And so I mix that up. Mix that separately. And bring out the butter. Go ahead and add that mixture to it. And I really try and mix these first. I'm usually doing this in a smaller bowl. That's what I mean, like this, a small bowl like what I have. So I mix that up. And one thing that I didn't say here, that I didn't put on the original mixture, I didn't say from the outset, is that I forgot to tell you, add vanilla, which is very important. So I'm adding that now. Now, most times they tell you in the Tollhouse recipe to add 1 teaspoon, I think it's 1 teaspoonful of vanilla. I add at least a tablespoon. Full tablespoon. The idea behind this is that, or anything with this, anything in this that I like the flavor of, I enhance it more, or I try to add more of it. Anything that seems too overwhelming, I back off on it. So I like vanilla. So I at least put a full tablespoon in there. Tablespoon, not teaspoon. And last of all are the eggs. So put 2 eggs in here and mix that up, and that will do it. Mix this up, and there we have our wet ingredients. Another thing I might mention is the reason the sugars are called wet ingredients and not, even though they're functionally they're dry, right? But the reason they're called wet is because they dissolve in the other wet ingredients. So functionally they are a wet ingredient and to be added at the same time. So, all right, so now we'll go ahead and mix everything together. Okay, so I've added the wet ingredients to the dry ingredients. I'm mixing them up thoroughly. And while I've been waiting, or while I'm doing this, before I put this chocolate bar, I use milk chocolate, and I use the Trader Joe's Belgian chocolate bars. And anyway, so I use milk chocolate. Some people might want to use the semi-sweet bars, which is the standard what the chips are in the Tollhouse recipe. But I use the milk chocolate. I guess I like the sweeter chocolate. So I use that, and I put it in the microwave for just about 15-20 seconds, just to soften it up, because we're going to be cutting it up here real soon. So set that mixture aside. And I take the, I cut it up the side, this. And I just keep it, the part of the wrapper underneath. Makes it easier to take up. And I just slice it into, as best I can, into 1/4 inch, like 1/4 by 1/4 inch pieces. So you're gonna get some 1/2 inch chunks in there probably, here and there. You chop it up, and hopefully the putting it, just softening it slightly in the microwave has helped make it a little bit more easy to chop. You don't want to do it too much. Once you start getting up, you know, like 30 seconds or something like that, this starts melting and it gets really messy. So I suggest about 15 seconds in the microwave on high. Alright, and we press it the other direction. So what you end up here with is big chunks of chocolate that are going to be really nice to come across when you're biting into a chocolate chip cookie. Alright, so chop those up a little bit more here and there, where you see any big chunks that are too big. Next I'm going to go ahead and add a cup of walnuts, or any, actually for that matter, any, you know, if you really like cashews or you really like macadamia, use those, but we're going to add the walnuts in this recipe. And then we're going to add, I usually don't add all of this. I add about 3/4 of a bar. Should be sufficient. So maybe I'll go back on that. Yeah, I think that should be sufficient. And then we'll go ahead and mix that up. Okay, so I've mixed this up thoroughly, and I just went over and washed my hands, since we're in the pandemic, and you know, I wanted to be careful in case I touched any surface, because now I'm really going to be actually using my hands on this food. Granted, these things will be heated up, but at the same time, you know, it's just playing it safe at this point in time. So what I do is I go ahead and I roll balls of this mixture of this dough, and I roll them up into 1.5, probably 1.5, maybe as much as 2 inches in diameter. And I roll these up and put them in a bag, in a Ziploc bag. What I'll do next, when I'm all through rolling these up, is that I'll go ahead and put these not in the refrigerator as the Tollhouse Recipe usually tells you to do, but I put them in the freezer. This has a dual purpose in that, for one, putting it in the freezer, when you bring them out and put them on the trays and put them in the oven, it takes longer when they're frozen. It takes them longer to splay out. That way you don't get this, you might have seen in some, if you've ever done some chocolate chip cookies, like say like with the Tollhouse Recipe, they'll tell you to put it in the refrigerator, you bring it out, you put it on the pan, and maybe like 10 minutes into cooking, they're already all splayed out flat. And your cookie is much thinner, and the edges tend to be, these sharp edges, and I don't like that at all. So I want to make them kind of not totally retain the shape of a ball, but basically not to splay out as much once they're in the oven. So anyway, I go ahead, but the other purpose of putting these in the freezer as opposed to the refrigerator is that when you put them in the freezer, that way they can keep much longer. So I can bring these out, say, I want five cookies this week, and I cook up those 5. Then maybe a month later I go, I want another 5 cookies. Or say, I'm having some friends over, I'm just going to cook the rest of the batch. You can do whatever. I'm not sure how long you can keep the dough in the freezer. I think it's probably about 3 to 4 months is probably what I would say would be the limit. But yeah. So anyway, that's what. Okay, so the dough has been in the refrigerator for actually 6 hours. So 6 hours is probably on the low side, but let's say 6 hours minimum in the freezer. So now we go to the freezer, get out our dough, and sometimes, a lot of times actually, this dough will have kind of glommed onto each other in the process of freezing. Before it actually freezes, it will have probably kind of got stuck, so it helps to kind of pry it apart, maybe with a fork or something like that, into its separate elements, the separate balls. But first off, I really like to use this parchment paper as opposed to sticking it directly on the pan. It helps, obviously, for it to not stick to the pan as much, and I think it, to a certain extent, also prevents the cookies from possibly getting overcooked or even burnt on the underside. So yeah, I always use some parchment paper. So stick that parchment paper down there, and got 2 pans here. Usually I figure I can fit probably about 5, max 6 per pan. Give some room to kind of spread out. So these are our balls here. I've kind of pre-pried them out, so they look a little bit more as separate units than they probably might if you pull your bag of these balls of dough out of the freezer. So anyway, we are going to go ahead and set them. I'm going to set 5 to a pan. Alright, so this oven has been set for about 15 minutes at 375 degrees Fahrenheit. 375, and I'm going to go ahead and put these in here. We're going to do it a total of 20 minutes. That might sound like a little bit more than you're used to, but I'd say 18 to 20 minutes in the oven. And what I like to do is midway, I'll go ahead and pull these out and rearrange them top to bottom, turn them around. That's because the oven doesn't have uniform heat throughout. It has hot spots and cooler points. Probably with a better oven, it might have more uniform, or if it's a convection oven, it has more uniform heat throughout. But with this oven, it's a cheapo, and it's really best to kind of move and rotate the pans at least once midway. Okay, as I said, midway at the 10-minute mark, which we're at, we want to pull these pans out, switch the levels, top on bottom, bottom on top, rotate pans themselves, and I'd say we'll give it another 8 minutes, check it, and if they're not ready, then we'll give them another 20. So we're gonna go ahead and do that. So 18 minutes, a little shy. Better to take it out too early than too late. So now I'm, as quickly as possible, I'm trying to put these cookies onto the rack, because actually the cookies are still actually cooking as they sit on the pan. The pan's still pretty hot, so we want to get them off the pan as soon as possible. So there we go. So there you have it. Something to do on a rainy day in the middle of a pandemic. Make yourself some Mother's Cookies Roadhouse recipe. Sit down, have a glass of milk, have a cookie. Keep washing your hands and shelter in place and do the social distancing thing. And above all, don't listen to anything Donald Trump says. Bye.